Welcome back to a very special episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. Now, every day we dive into how technology is solving real-world problems in both our lives, business, and even world, come to think of it. I'm your host, Neil C. Hughes, and today we've got a fascinating discussion lined up for you because the relationship between designers and developers has long been an intricate dance, often fraught with challenges. But what if there was a way to bridge the gap and enhance collaboration? Well, today I'm joined by two experts from Figma, a company famous for making waves in the world of design and development. And today we'll be exploring their latest innovation, DevMode, which promises to transform the way that designers and developers work together. So today I've invited two people, one from each side of the spectrum. Lauren Andres, a designer advocate at Figma, and Jenny Lea, software developer at Figma, where together we'll shed light on the transformative power of DevMode and much, much more. But enough from me. Buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening in the world, I'm going to be beaming your ears all the way to the US and the UK at the exact same time through the wonders of technology to discuss all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. We've got two great guests today. So to begin with, Lauren, can you just tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, you bet. So my name is Lauren Andres. I am a designer advocate at Figma, which means that we really focus on kind of helping others to learn Figma. So I used to be a product designer. So I've been in the files, kind of doing it myself as a product designer. And now my main role is helping others to kind of get up to speed with new features, helping a lot of customers figure out kind of how to organize their files and all of that stuff. So it's really fun getting to work with a lot of community members.
Fantastic. What a warm welcome to the show. And here in the UK, we've got yourself, Jenny, too. So can you tell everyone listening a little about you too?
Yeah, so my name is Jenny Lea and I am a software developer at Figma, specifically working on DevMode, which is a new space in Figma specifically for developers to help take ideas from design to production. And I've been here for almost 3 years and worked on a little bit of everything. So if it's the UI, the canvas, or code gen, I've probably gone in and had a look.
Well, I mean, you mentioned DevMode there, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk about today, especially around collaboration dynamics. So to begin with, can you tell me a little about how DevMode specifically addresses the traditional challenges in the designer-developer relationship and also fosters better collaboration? Because huge talking point, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's huge in designer-developer collaboration. I think one of our biggest goals is to start getting designers and developers to kind of like talk in the same language and start to learn the same things. I think it's really, really helpful in just speeding up the process of getting everybody aligned for things like the code, and Jenny will be able to talk about the code gen a little bit more than me, but the code gen and things like adding in the statuses. So on our frames, for people who aren't like super familiar with Figma, we can add in a status now as a designer to let our developers know what's ready for dev and what's not, just kind of making things a little bit easier for them to find. Areas where they can figure out like what's recently changed, something called compare changes, and be able to see like when that was last changed and what was changed. So they're not working off of old designs or old files, and they can see exactly what's changed since they last been in there. So there's a lot of really great features. And one thing I always really love to mention too, I feel like DevMode has helped us even give us a platform to just even talk about this more, is that Figma is so great for collaboration, but nothing will ever replace just talking to each other. And it's really helped us to just get that word out too of like, okay, now that you have this place to talk, like each of you has kind of this area of our developers can look at it in DevMode and our designers can see that, and you can see what you're talking about, but you can have these conversations too, which nothing is ever going to really replace those conversations of happening to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, I think it's just about making everything else a little bit easier so you can actually focus on the collaboration rather than focus on context switching because you've gone from one tool to another tool, or finding the latest version, or going through screenshots and realizing they're the older screenshots. So you're a bit annoyed because you wasted time and therefore your collaboration is worse. So it's just greasing the rails for everything else to run a bit more smoothly.
100%. And you was talking there about the importance of talking to one another. It's not just about the technology and the code, it's about that language alignment, understanding what everybody's talking about. So on that side of things, in what ways does aligning on language through tools like DevMode, how does that help in bridging that communication gap between designers and developers?
One thing that I remember from my past job of not aligning on communication of we had icons and like the designers called the icons one thing, but the developers in their code base called the icons something completely different. And at one point, we realized that the developers were having to rename every single icon when they exported them. And we were like, that's silly. Like, why are we doing that? Why don't we just change the names of them? Like, I don't really care what they're called. And if we hadn't had that conversation about it, like we wouldn't have known. So that's where like the communication is still key. And we were able to change what all the icons were so that they weren't having to do extra work on the back end of it. But when it comes to dev mode, so like there's things that I think designers know really, really well, and there's things that developers know really, really well. And I think it's key still to let people who know what they're doing really well do those things. And one thing that I think it's one of my favorite parts of dev mode is the dev resources, which are basically our developers now can go in here and add in links that are going to be helpful to them. And we've had component descriptions, which our designers can go in and add links and resources that are important to them. And I always used to tell people, oh, here you can put like a resource for your developers, like a GitHub link or a storybook link. But in reality, I had no idea what those links were. Like as a designer, I would always get a 404 like error when I tried to get in there because I didn't have a GitHub login. So being able to allow our developers to put those in themselves and know exactly what they need, I think give each person the ability to add in what they need themselves and that they know is just really, really helpful so that we can each kind of focus on what's going to be the best for us and then come together and discuss like, okay, here's what I'm going to need, all of that stuff.
I have another fun example of the language alignment. So one thing that even in the very early days of DevMode that we started working on was something called Auto Layout v4. So Figma already had auto layout, and meaning you could auto layout the things in your frames. And this was kind of like Flexbox, but not exactly like Flexbox. So when you were a designer, you had one mental model of how things would be positioned, or you just use absolute positioning because it was easier than trying to understand auto layout. But then when you were a developer, you'd never use absolute positioning, or you'd use Flexbox, which is kind of the same but different. So Auto Layout v4 was a project of making Auto Layout more like Flexbox. And then I think since that, there's Auto Layout Wrap, which is like Flex Wrap. And it just takes out the extra layer of effort trying to translate something from the design space to the dev space when actually you're accomplishing the same thing, just using different language for it.
Love that. And of course, designers and developers do have so many differences and may even talk a different language on occasion too. But the one thing that they do share very often is that audience-centric approach. So how would you say DevMode facilitates a more audience-focused approach in the design and development process? And why is that shared focus so crucial, do you think?
I think it's mainly just crucial for aligning on your intent and actually delivering the outcomes of a project. Because ultimately, it is about delivering value to your users. And as a designer, you're probably thinking about that a lot. But if you're a developer that's getting something thrown over the fence that you just have to spec out into HTML or CSS or whatever, you can sometimes lose that idea because you're just converting pixels from one place to another. But if we have developers coming into Figma and into DevMode, seeing designs as they evolve or feeling comfortable to be involved earlier in the process, they can actually think about their users as people and the outcomes that we want to achieve for those users. And this helps them have input on designs, because just because I'm a developer doesn't mean I don't get to think about how things work or what our user experience is going to be, or bring another experience or perspective to the table that maybe our designer hasn't thought about. So I think it's just involving everybody in the process at lots of different stages means we can facilitate a more audience-focused product as a whole.
Yeah, I think Jenny nailed it.
Yeah. And there are so many designers, developers, and business leaders that will be listening to this conversation today from every corner of the world. And I'd love to try and bring it to life, everything we're talking about here. So are you able to share a few examples or maybe even case studies where DevMode has transformed that working relationship between designers and developers?
Yeah, I know that there's a really great video on Decathlon and Lanier of how kind of they started using DevMode. And somebody in that video says that they were literally speaking different languages than it, kind of like you just said in another question, and it brought them together with that. It's been really cool too. As a designer advocate, one of my roles is kind of going to customers and seeing how they're working with their teams and talking about DevMode too, and seeing like, how is this working for you? What can we add? What is working? What isn't working? And seeing their reactions to it of like, oh, like this is when we like kind of go over specific things of like, oh, this is really going to change the game. Like, oh, this is going to be really helpful. Even things like I was with a customer and kind of showing them detached instances. So detached components. If somebody detaches a component, it can make it a little bit tricky for a developer to ever know, like, was that a component beforehand? Do they need to rebuild something completely new? And kind of showing this to a customer and being like, oh, this is going to be really helpful for us to be able to see like, oh, I don't need to rebuild something completely from scratch. A designer just detach this for one reason or another. And then we can kind of, that'll help start that conversation again, going back to having those real conversations of like, hey, why'd you detach this? Do we need to build a new one? Can we just use one that already exists? But yeah, I think there's a lot of really great just kind of stories of hearing from people of, wow, this is working, it's exciting, or even kind of what's not working too, because we want to know that. And we've gotten really great feedback that we've been able to implement already of like, hey, this isn't quite how we work. So let's kind of at Figma, we're like, okay, well, let's make it how you work because we want this to be as helpful as possible for y'all.
And if we dig a little bit deeper on that, is there anything you can share on how DevMode can better streamline the translation of designs into code and maybe what impact this has on productivity and project timelines? Because that's where the magic happens, right?
I could write a whole novel on the iterations of design to code and where we came from and where we are now. I think it's funny because it was a big focus at the beginning. As a bit of background, Figma has always been thinking about the entire product development cycle, like from ideation to design to development. But about 3 years ago, when I joined Figma, they acquired this little startup called Visly, which is where I came from, where we were basically a more developer-first tool generating code from your designs. And this was literally, you draw your components in something that wasn't Figma, but looked a bit like Figma, and it would generate a load of code and plonk it all into your files, and everything would just work for you. So when we joined Figma, we had a big focus on design to code and thought we needed to generate like super comprehensive code so everybody could use it straight away and it would all just magically work and be really nice. And everybody thinks auto-generated code is the answer. But like most things, it's not that simple because designs in Figma don't map straight to code. And people have been burned a lot in the past by design to code tools just generating rubbish effectively. And then also you'll have a load of existing code base with existing patterns or accessibility tools that you use or loads of other stuff that people have spent time building beforehand. So we can't just generate code in your style language framework because we don't know what that is. We basically knew that DevMode needed to have generated code, but went on a big journey to figure out kind of how comprehensive this code needed to be. And actually, we found out that in terms of productivity, it was better to help people make more incremental gains on things that you'd normally be wasting time on, like box shadows and stuff that you have to go and relearn CSS every time you want to try and do it, or certain other quirks about layouting things that you know how to write. It's just kind of long to have to remember how to write it every time. So we thought if we generate these things as a springboard, it could get you started writing your own code. But then also loads of our customers use design systems, and we're encouraging people using Figma to use design systems. So we want generated code to instead just point at these existing components and how to use them. And for that, we're encouraging people to use plugins and write their own code gen plugins, so the generated code can actually be relevant to the projects that you already have and the components that you're already using. And instead, we're just hooking up the designs in Figma to the components and props that are already implemented in your code base.
And you made a great point about accessibility there. And I think it's another area designers and developers share at the moment, is that passion for user experience and increased accessibility. So how would you say DevMode contributes to creating more accessible and more user-friendly applications and programs? Because again, it's something that's increasing in importance, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think a couple of ways. I think Jenny was just talking about design systems, which I think are huge in it, in that design systems are going to allow you as like the systems designer to create buttons or other components, any real components that you know are accessible already. And then your team can pull from those, both your design team and your development team, and not have to like remake from scratch every time and wonder like, are these colors going to be accessible? Is this button size going to be accessible? So I think the idea, like, especially with variables, now that developers can see variables, if they've been added to the designs, they can see them in DevMode and be able to, as they're using VS Code, just kind of like pull those quickly. Being able essentially to have a lot of accessibility work happen at the beginning and translate through and not have to reinvent the wheel kind of as you're going. And I think too, just certain areas in DevMode that are meant to allow things to be happening quicker, just to being able to grab information quicker, all this stuff that is now freeing up more time to focus on the accessibility, just allowing us to like spend all of that time thinking, okay, how can we make this more accessible? How do we make sure that this is going to be readable or the right color so that everybody can see it, all of that type of thing. So I think just really allowing that time, now that we don't have to spend doing other things, we can focus that time back into something like accessibility that is super important. Because
and just going back a moment to the bridging of the communications gap, how would you say DevMode handles things like feedback, iteration cycles, etc., between designers and developers? Does it offer any unique features for this too?
I think the plugin ecosystem is good for this, because one problem that I have, and I think a lot of developers have, is that we're in about a bazillion different tools, because you've got designers giving you designs in Figma, and then you're tracking your tasks to do in Jira or Asana or Linear. And then in terms of actually writing your code, you're in a code editor. So you're always switching between these different tools that all have comments, and you're chatting to people in Slack. So feedback doesn't just happen in one place. You're getting feedback from all of these different tools, which are really hard to keep track of. But by using plugins for DevMode, Jira being a great example, you're just putting things into the same place. So you don't have to change tabs and see that somebody's commented on the ticket of something that you're working on. You can link it to a design in Figma, and then when you click on the design and run the plugin, it'll open the Jira ticket, and you can see that the product manager has commented saying, maybe we'll delay this a few weeks because it's not ready yet. Or you can see that the design has updated and actually you should be implementing something a bit different. So this feedback loop is just tightened a bit, because you're not dropping things because they keep happening in apps that you're not expecting them to. Similarly with Figma for VS Code, we've built a plugin for VS Code where you can run Figma directly in your code editor. And we know engineers don't read emails. We know engineers ignore their notifications. But if we're putting them in VS Code next to where your files live, next to where your code is, you're going to see that a designer has replied to a comment that you've left in Figma, or tagged you in a comment saying they've updated something, which again just tightens this loop, stops you dropping things, and hopefully makes developers more involved so they can comment and know where things are going to go or get back to them.
Yeah. And with iterations too, I feel like the compare changes feature is really huge in that it allows you to see those even like minuscule changes, like a corner radius has been changed or something like that, really calling it out, being able to see the before and after almost, so that you can see what's happened in those iterations. And it's one thing too that I get really excited about as a designer, because even though it's called DevMode, it's obviously our goal was for developers, but there are so many things in DevMode that I think are useful for designers, like compare changes. Since Figma is such a collaborative tool, there's often multiple designers in a file, and like I could go away for the week and have somebody else working in this file, and when I come back as a designer, I kind of want to see, okay, what's changed? What's gone on since I was here, even since yesterday? What's gone on since I was here? I can see the changes that have happened from other designers, even as a non-developer. So I feel like compare changes is a really powerful tool for that, to see those iterations in there. And there's a couple other in DevMode that are just like, okay, this is really, it's meant for our developers, but it's really, really helpful for our designers, which is why I'm always recommending to designers. It's so crucial that designers understand DevMode so that they can not just relay the information to their developers, but also know how to use it themselves and help themselves too in Figma, because I think it's really helpful for that.
Absolutely love that. And of course, the designer-developer relationship is often difficult to navigate. And for me personally, I've just loved hearing you both talking about some of the problems that you're seeing and experiencing from two different angles and how you're working together there. Absolutely fantastic. But what I always try and do at the end of the podcast is always also try and find out a little bit more about my guests and have a little bit of fun with you. So I've got two separate questions here. Lauren, to begin with, is that a funny or interesting story from your career that you can share with everyone listening today?
Yeah, I feel like a whole like section of my career is an interesting story in itself. Before I came to Figma, I worked at Grubhub, which is a food delivery service, and I was a product designer there. But before that, which was I think back in like 2017, I worked at Lego, and I was a model builder. And I worked at the U.S. headquarters, and I literally built like those huge sculptures that you see like in the Lego stores and stuff. That was my job. So it's just it was a fascinating time of like, I built like, I think there was 2 full-size cars that I was on, like a full-size, I think it was a Cadillac, and then a Batmobile that was like 8 feet long or something. I delivered a statue of Big Papi, who's a baseball player in the U.S. on the Red Sox. We got to deliver a statue of him to himself in Boston. I got to go to Australia to build an 8-foot Death Star. There was a lot of just wild things that, like, looking back, it's like that was my job. That's wild. And there was so many just wild stories in general that happened while we were there, of like just crazy things we built. But inevitably everybody would have like a few stories of a model that they were building that they totally messed up, or like something went wrong. Like they built the bricks were like 1 brick off, and then at the end you had a huge gap, or like something went wrong. But there's a quote that a woman, Arlene, that I used to work with, said after, like, we were all sharing kind of the stories of like, what did you do wrong? Where did you mess up? And she said, I guess if you never make any mistakes, you never have any good stories to tell. And that is my absolute favorite quote that I always like am thinking about, because nobody ever wants to hear like, how did you really succeed? Like, how did you do that perfectly? Like, I feel like it's always the funnest stories are like, how did you totally mess that up and have to fix it in the very last moment, like, sort of thing. So yeah, mine is just kind of the whole, I think I was there for about 2 years, and it was just a wild experience that I feel like I could do like a whole podcast of individual wild stories from Lego. But I'm my one fun fact that I always like to tell people is I'm forklift certified because of working at Lego. So I am, if you need any tall things, heavy things moved, I have a forklift certification that is definitely expired, and I should not be using it at all, and I do not. But I do have the certification, and I keep it in my wallet because it's just a fun thing to say.
How cool is that? Please tell me you use all this stuff for your Instagram page as well, man, with all these Lego things and forklift truck driving, man. There's a lot of great content there, surely.
I know, right? I should. My Instagram is actually all baking things, so I'm a huge baker.
Okay.
But I am like every now and then people will ask me about the job, and I'll find like video. There's a ton of videos on YouTube of time lapses that we did, and I'm like, if you stop it real quick, there I am. You could see me. There I am. So there's a lot of like really cool videos on YouTube. But yep, it was a fun past life that I lived.
So cool. And Jenny, in your area of work, there's so much pressure to be in a state of almost continuous learning. So I've got to ask on behalf of everyone listening there, how or where do you self-educate to keep up to speed with the latest trends, etc.? Anything you can share around that?
I don't know if this classes as self-education, but I'm a big fan of just learning as much from others as I can. So specifically in software engineering, I love to do pair programming with other people as often as possible. And this literally just means working on the same problem at the same time, writing code together. And I think it's a great way of learning via osmosis, because it's not like going to a presentation or a talk where people are telling you what they think you want to hear. It's more like you're learning how people think, or things just come out of the woodwork naturally if it's something that someone's been thinking about for a long time, or some really complex concept that they just understand and you never really got the hang of, or I don't know, some shortcut for VS Code that you never saw and they're using all the time. So I think just putting yourself in the position to work directly with other people on problems that you wouldn't normally work on, or problems that you think are really boring, and getting other people to work on them with you is a great way to just tease out new learnings and new habits that you wouldn't have picked up otherwise. And it's great to get to know your colleagues as well.
100%. And I always say at the end of every episode that technology works best when it brings people together. And I love just listening to your conversation today, how it's transforming the relationship between designers and developers and building better collaboration by aligning on language, focusing on the audience, etc. And also had some cracking stories at the end of it. But more than anything, just a big thank you to both of you for taking the time to share your stories today.
Yeah, thank you. This was awesome.
So a huge thank you to Lauren and Jenny for joining me on the podcast today and shedding light on that transformative power of DevMode. As we wrap up the episode, I think it's clear that better collaboration and understanding between designers and developers are at the heart of creating exceptional digital experiences. So it was great for me, from the outside looking in, learning more about how DevMode is paving the way for a more streamlined and efficient workflow. Ultimately, something that benefits both the creators and the end users. So again, I extend my gratitude to today's guests, Lauren and Jenny, for sharing their insights and experiences. And as you know, I always encourage everyone listening to stay curious, embrace innovation, and keep exploring the ever-evolving world of technology. And with that in mind, quick shout out to We Got Your Mac. It is the ultimate resource for organizations deciding whether to embrace Apple Mac's platform at scale. It allows you to discover how to successfully deploy Mac alongside existing platforms and vendors, all with expert advice from IT and business leaders. So if this is something that is exciting to you right now, or even overwhelming and daunting, tune into the podcast for new episodes every 2 weeks and visit wegotyourmac.com to get recommended resources on how you can embrace Apple Mac's platform at scale in the enterprise. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, everything this podcast stands for, please don't forget, subscribe, rate and review, because it really does help continue bringing you engaging conversations like the one we had today. But that's it for me. So thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.